Chapter 15. Parry and Thrust. Taunos felt that entire weight of the kingdom of Yosha now rested on his shoulders, and he did not like it one bit. 4 months had passed since the fateful argument, and in that time there was no sign of Mishra. He had vanished from the palace, and the Phalange, the dragon engine, and his war machine had vanished from the gates soon after midnight. The Phalange had been prepared for the departure of that. Taunos had no doubt. Mounted scouts were dispatched that evening up and down the river, but there was no sign of them. Urza had to wait for morning to dispatch the ornithopters, and that was when the scouts had discovered that a ferry barge upriver had been seized and sunk on the far bank. The assumption was that Mishra and his engines had fled west into the Transmardan territories that bordered on Phalange territory. Then from the east came a report that a collection of brass helmets and Phalange gear had been found by a farmer, indicating that Mishra's forces were making instead for the Kh ridges. Soon after, a horseman arrived from the sword marches, declaring that a great metallic beast had been spotted there, moving only at night and heading north. Military units were shunted first one way, then another in response to each new rumor. To make matters worse, Urza took to the field with one of the ornithopter flights and moved continually from one sighting to the next. It had been 4 months, and Urza had still not returned to Krug nor sent any message to his wife the Queen. Taunos received numerous orders for new developments and changes to the ornithopter design and instructions for coordinating the production of a line of Avenger-style automatons. But these messages were always technical in nature, without a hint of curiosity about Taunos's own well-being, nor that of Urza's wife, nor the situation in the capital. The last was deteriorating quickly. A rumor had spread that the chief artificer's evil brother was hiding among the Phalange traders still in the city, plotting an insurrection. The resulting riots killed 17 Phalange, including Taunos had heard one of the musicians who had played at the banquet. Those with ties to the desert fled the city and other Yoshan cities as quickly as possible. This created another rumor that the first rumor had been planted by Mishra so he and his men could escape. In the confusion, the resulting violence overmatched the capabilities of the temples to cope, as resources earmarked for study and supplies were suddenly diverted to the homeless and the wounded. The priests clamored for more of the magical talismans Urza had created early in his career there, but the artificer was not present to create them. Taunos heard that people were now beginning to doubt their leaders. If Urza was so wise, ran the common tale, why could he not find his own brother in his wife's own land? Either Urza was not as smart as the people had thought, which was unsettling, or Mishra was much smarter, which was even more troubling. Now, rumors of invasion of the sword marches or of the Transmardan territories were regular fare in the inns and taverns, and many of the merchants spoke of relocating to the coastal provinces for the duration of the hostilities. Indeed, there was some confusion among the common folk about what exactly had happened at the end of the conference. The general story was that Urza and his brother came to blows, but the nature of the argument was not clear. Some said it was about the sword marches. Another story was that Urza had accused Mishra of stealing his ideas and making his dragon engines. No, it was the other way around. Others said Urza had stolen the idea of the ornithopters from his brother. There were a few comments about Kayla herself, but those were only voiced by low individuals in shadowy bars and were given no credence. Or at least Taunos hoped that was the case. The confused mood of the city was matched by that in the palace. The captain of the guard was frantic, as his orders were regularly countermanded by those of Urza from the field. The seneschal, who had warmly welcomed the Phalange, was now frantically trying to prove he was as tough as the old warlord himself had been. The queen kept to her quarters, and would see a select number of people, using the matron as a last line of defense against intruders. She would speak to the seneschal, the captain of the guard, and Taunos, and not to anyone else. Unfortunately for the remnants of the Privy Council, most of her commands were along the lines of "do as you see fit," superseded only by "what would Urza want?" And to make matters worse, the matron had informed Taunos, through numerous allusions and euphemisms, that Her Majesty was in the family way. Indeed, when Taunos spoke with the Queen, she seemed more haggard and tired than usual. Taunos sent Urza a gently worded dispatch detailing Kayla's condition, but received in return only a list of corrections to the armature of the Avengers. Taunos could not understand the coldness of Urza's response until he did the math. Given the phases of the mist moon and the advancement of Kayla's pregnancy, she would have had to have conceived sometime during the week of the meetings with the Phalange, probably toward the end of that week before Urza left the city. Urza had departed hot on the heels of Mishra. Taunos did not like to consider what that might mean, but he had no doubt Urza realized it at once. And last, there was the problem of Ashno, still held as a hostage in the guest wing of the palace. All attempts to contact the Phalange to negotiate her release had failed. A number of people wanted her executed for crimes that remained as fuzzy as the explanation of what happened between Urza and Mishra. The staff with its sickening energies had been a surprise to Taunos, and the guards had stripped her room of anything with which she might be able to make a weapon. The staff remained in Taunos's care. The device itself was a beautiful creation, and he sought permission from the Queen to speak with Ashno about it. At least that was the excuse that he gave Kayla. "Where did you get the knowledge that helped you build the staff?" he asked at one point. "Was it an old text? A scholar? A wanderer from another land?" Ashno remained perched on the window-sill, the morning sun shining resplendently on her hair. She said nothing. "It will be easier if you talk," said Taunos. "Keeping silence isn't going to get you anywhere." Ashno's head snapped around to regard Taunos. Then she smiled and said, "I've got a joke. Care to hear it?" Taunos looked puzzled. "Matron and the Queen are talking. Matron says, whatever else you say about that Mishra, at least he dresses well. And the Queen says, yes, and quickly too. What I think? That's not funny," sputtered Taunos. "You know, there are temple inquisitors who have put themselves at our disposal just to wring your secrets out of you. But you're keeping them at bay," said Ashno, sliding off her perch. "And why is that, baby duck?" Taunos bristled but kept his voice calm. "Because they might damage you. Any knowledge you have might be lost. I might choose to die with my secrets rather than betray Master Mishra," sighed Ashno. "You are so naive and so kind. No wonder you're the Queen's favorite." "What do you know?" said Taunos, defensive again. Ashno waved her hand. There's not a lot to do here, sir. I listen to the guards, the chambermaids, the people outside the window. I think you're keeping me around because you need someone to talk to. Marmaduke Urza is gone and poor Kayla is wrapped up in blaming herself. That's why you're here. Taunos did not reply but kept his head on his chest. Regarding the table, a long silence spread out between the two. Finally Ashno sat down at the table across from Urza's apprentice. The way I see it, it's a question of approach, she said at last. Her tone was calm, almost conversational. What is? Taunos responded. Ashno sighed and shook her head. The staff. Wasn't that what we were talking about? Among other things, said Taunos, the hurt still in his voice. Don't be like that, snapped Ashno. Look. Have you worked in a slaughterhouse? Taunos blinked. I worked as a fisherman once. Completely different, said Ashno. Fish are low creatures, barely worth the spine they have. If you work at sawing up carcasses, you notice how the joints fit, how the nerves are arrayed, and how the skin peels back. I've dissected creatures, said Taunos. Birds, for example, to study their wings for the ornithopters. But never one that was still alive when you cut into it. Correct? Asked Ashno. Taunos did not respond, but his face gave away his answer. Ashno continued, as I said, there's a difference of approach. You and Marmaduke Urza don't want to get your hands dirty, to deal with the blood and skin and muscle and nerves and fluids. You'd never have stumbled on the idea of frying an opponent's nerves with something like my staff. I don't know if that's a responsible goal, said Taunos. Beside the point, said Ashno sharply, slapping the tabletop with her palm. Taunos saw the fire in her eyes again. The inventing fire. You're looking at the bird wing and thinking about how to duplicate it. I'm looking at the bird wing and thinking about how to incorporate it, how to make it function. Again. If I were building ornithopters, I would have used rock wings. I'd have kept them alive with their own blood and nutrients and tethered them to the housing. That's impossible, said Taunos. A girl can dream, said Ashno and smiled again. But I think that's what they did with the dragon engine. The original builders, I mean. They didn't try to duplicate a dragon with metal and cable, like the old Thran would. Rather they started with a dragon and built outward until the machinery replaced the dragon entirely. The fire blazed in the Scarlet Woman's eyes again. You can't be afraid of living things, or dead things for that matter, she said. Living tissue is one more set of tools we can use. If we only get past our backward concept that it's somehow inviolate, we can truly make progress. She looked at Taunos and shrugged. That's what I think, at least. Mishra might disagree. I think the answer is within the body, not outside it. The discussion had taken a disturbing turn for Taunos. In an effort to divert it into other channels, he said, where do you think Mishra is now? Is there a special hiding place he has? Ashno shook her head. He doesn't need to hide right now. He has his brother right where he wants him, running all over the place looking for him. Was that his plan? Asked Taunos. Ashno paused a moment, then shook her head. I don't particularly know that Mishra had a plan. He is very good at setting things up, but then he throws caution to the winds and spins the wheel of fate. Madness, muttered Taunos. Or divine inspiration, countered Ashno. So he didn't let you in on his plans, continued Taunos. If he did, would I be here, living in all this luxury? Ashno waved her hands at the bare walls of her quarters. No. And it's not that he's secretive, though he is. I really don't think he had an exact plan when he came to Krug, but I do know he'd be happy with the result. Taunos sighed. I wish I could believe you. Ashno frowned, then spread her hands. Look, I'll give you this one free of charge. Mishra is not one to let an opportunity pass, and with Urza thoptering all over creation, this is an opportunity for Mish to hurt his brother and hurt him bad. And the Qadir is such a hothead that he'll declare a full jihad at the drop of a brass hat. So something is coming. But you don't know what or where, said Taunos. Ashno shrugged. One more thing, then, she said. You wondered how I got the staff in here. Taunos said, I assumed our guards were lax during the festivities. Ashno smiled. It was a dazzling smile. The black Thunderwood staff I walked in with. You saw it on the first day. Who could deny a woman her walking staff? The skull was smuggled in, but the gold wire was sewn into the hem of my bodice, and the power stones were brought in among my jewelry. Taunos looked at the tabletop. He had watched her assemble the weapon without realizing it. There's a point to this. Only this, said Ashno. All the components came together at the right moment to produce the staff. That's what's going to happen, regardless of what it is. Everything will come together at once, and she motioned with her hands. Boom. Taunos stood up. You've given me something to think about. Several things, in fact. Ashno rose with him. Yes, and one of the things will probably be, can I trust her? The answer is, no you can't, but you should at least listen. Okay. Taunos nodded and turned toward the door. Ashno called out his name, and he turned back toward her. Ashno leaned forward and kissed the apprentice. Taunos started as if prodded by a dagger thrust. Ashno ignored the reaction. That's thanks. Thanks for not turning me over to the temples. And thanks for coming and talking to me. You're a good duck. And she smiled. Outside, in the hall, Taunos rubbed his cheek where Ashno had kissed him. The skin was still warm. Urza, muttered his apprentice, wherever you are, you'd better get back here soon. Lieutenant Sharamen had the privilege of delivering the report to Chief Artificer Urza. He and another pilot had discovered Mishra's war machine at the center of the large encampment 3 hours flight to the west. It was the first sighting of one of Mishra's engines since the troops had begun this wild goose chase, and Sharaman was delighted to finally see some results from their work. The ocean flies were at the third base camp, each one pressing deeper into the enemy territory of the Great Desert. The sword marchers were weeks away by foot, and everything at the camp had to be flown in. Sharaman longed for the relative luxuries of the home base, hot meals, attentive women, and most of all, hot water to bathe in. However, mentioning such desires was a quick way to lose one's wings, and Sharaman would rather fly than have the attentions of the most attractive women in Yosha. Urza was seated beneath his tarp, hunched over a makeshift table. At the table was a hand-drawn map of the desert. In addition to pursuing his brother, the chief artificer was conducting the first true survey of this area. Evenings were filled with reports of hills, ridges, dry washes, and a number of curious rock piles that the prince consort referred to as Thran sites. Sharaman stepped beneath the tarp, clicked his heels, and saluted. "Sire, we have a sighting of the Great War Machine." Urza did not look up from the map. "Report," he said. "A large encampment of tents with the war machine at their center." "Where?" snapped Urza. "A quarter-day's flight from here, 15 degrees south of due west." Urza traced the line Sharaman had defined. "Yes. That would make perfect sense. If we had continued on our present line of attack, we might have missed it." My brother did not take into account wide lateral patrols, it seems. To the lieutenant he said, "Were you spotted?" "No signs," said Sharaman. "They tend to hide from us now." "Indeed," said Urza, raising one eyebrow. "Best to assume they know we've spotted them, and they're likely to be already packing camp. Ready all the ornithopters. Take all the goblin bombs." "Sire," asked Sharaman, "is there a problem, Lieutenant?" The chief artificer looked up. For the first time, his face was lined and drawn, more so than would be accounted for by the continual desert wind. "It is late in the day, sire," said Sharaman, choosing his words carefully. "I am aware of the time, Lieutenant," said Urza. His voice was icy. "But if we wait for the morrow, Mishra will be gone." "It will be dusk before we arrive," protested the ornithopter pilot. "And it will be midnight if we keep talking about it," snarled Urza. "Now get to it. I want the entire patrol in the air in 15 minutes. Sharaman stiffened, saluted smartly, and retreated. As the pilot left the tent, he was already bellowing orders to the other flyers and support staff. There was an immediate eruption of activity as the various artifice students beetled over the machines, making final preparations. Those pilots who had flown with Urza before he had begun checking their machines as soon as they saw Sharaman head for the prince consort's tent. Sharaman did not like it. An evening attack was dangerous and meant either setting down in enemy territory for the night or risking treacherous night winds and ghoul spots on the flight back. Still, the chief artificer was not to be denied, particularly in the matter of his brother. They were ready in 10 minutes, 5 ornithopters plus Urza's own craft. All with the double bend wing design now, of the type in which Urza had flown to call in the Urza's craft remained the best of the lot and was the best maintained. It had a wingspan half again as long as the others and carried twice as many of the dangerous goblin bombs. The latter had been flown all the way from the sword marches and were kept cool and wrapped in damp cloths. The flight toward the enemy was uneventful, though Sharaman was aware of the lengthening shadows of the hills and the silhouettes of the craft fleeing ahead of them over the rough ground. When they crested the last rise, the camp was still there. The tents of white cloth shining red in the light of the dying sun. In the center, glowing like an ingot, brooded the hulk of Mishra's war machine. Something struck Sharaman as wrong, but he could not put his finger on it immediately. He had little time to think of it, for Urza waved his wings in the attack signal. The 6 ornithopters broke into 2 groups of 3. Sharaman led one, while Urza commanded the other. Urza's half of the flight activated their wings and beat to gain altitude, while Sharaman's banked and began a low bombing run over the camp. Sharaman locked his wings in gliding position and reached around for the goblin bombs. Without looking down, he heaved one after another over the edge of the ornithopter's canopy. These attacks were intended to frighten and disorient the camp natives. Real accuracy would be needed at the end of the bombing run, when the target would be the Great War Hulk. There was no immediate response from the ground, and Sharaman looked ahead. The great metallic wain, some 50 feet in height, was looming ahead. They were dropping faster than Sharaman had anticipated, and Sharaman considered re-engaging the engine and gaining a bit more altitude before reaching the Hulk. Then the war machine opened fire, and his exact elevation was the least of Sharaman's problems. The war machine came alive as they neared. Windows slid open, and cupolas rotated to reveal ballistic catapults and other devices that Sharaman did not recognize. Something rose from the center of the war machine that looked like a great water pump. But instead of water, this last device spat fire. The air was filled with all manner of shot, stones, arrows, and huge ballistic bolts. Sharaman slammed open the wing locks and engaged the engine, hoping to rise above the torrent of incoming missiles. He avoided the bulk of them, but one great ballista bolt, an arrow the size of a small tree, drove into his right wing. Worse yet, the bolt had a barbed head and did not pass through the wing entirely. Suddenly the craft was pierced like a butterfly on a pin, and weighted down. Sharaman was unable to stay aloft. The lieutenant cursed and hit the emergency disconnect lever to disengage the wing entirely. The lever was jammed by the force of the bolt's blow and would not budge. Sharaman looked around for something with which to pry it loose, aware that he was already losing altitude quickly. Then he saw the box of goblin bombs and cursed louder. The bombs would explode on contact, and if they were on board when he hit the ground. Sharaman ignored the release mechanism, having determined he was going to crash, but equally determined to not leave a huge crater in the process. He picked up the entire crate of bombs from its cradle and shoved it over the side of the craft's housing. He was horribly low now, for the bombs detonated almost immediately, striking the ground and sending up a wave of billowing black and red force. The force of the blow flipped the ornithopter upside down, and it crashed that way, sliding into one of the sunlit red tents. Sharaman guessed he could not have been out for more than a moment. The smell of flames brought him to. Breathing hurt his chest, and there was a numbness along his left leg. Still, he knew he had to get out before the flames reached him. Sharaman pulled himself from the wreckage slowly. His left leg could not take any weight. He pulled a small knife from his vest, ready for any of the phalange who might suddenly attack now that his wings were clipped. But there were no phalange. The tent he had slammed into was empty. The only flames were those created by his own goblin bombs. That was what had bothered Sharaman when he was flying. He now realized it was evening, but there had been no cooking fires. The camp was abandoned already. They left the war engine, he thought. He half stumbled, half hopped to a broken pole from the tent and used it as a support. His initial attack had been a disaster. The only sign of his two fellow pilots were twin plumes of billowing smoke where their racks of goblin bombs had exploded upon crashing. He hoped their pilots had had the presence of mind to jettison before they struck. Already the second wave, led by Urza's white ornithopter, was pulling into position. Sharaman looked at the war machine. Why were there no people coming out to fight him? Were they all at the posts? Then he realized there was no one in the camp at all, including at the war machine. The weapons were firing, automatically responding to some device the chief artificer's brother had crafted to detect and assault trespassers. They were fighting ghosts, and they were dying for it. Sharaman tried to wave off the attacking wing of 3 craft, but Urza and the other pilots either ignored him or assumed he was one of the Phalangi. As soon as they neared the war machine, the Great Wayne released another volley of bolts. Both Urza and one other pilot pulled their machines up in time to avoid the onslaught, but the third was not so lucky. It flew into a flurry of small arrow shot. The arrows were not enough to damage the craft, but they pierced the housing and killed its operator. The ornithopter pulled into a spiral to the right, a slow, deadly glide that was punctuated at the end with an explosion. The other 2 craft were still making for the target, the smaller craft in the lead. Sharaman tried to understand why the Phalangi would leave behind the mighty war machine unguarded, the engine that Mishra had brought to Krug as a demonstration of his abilities. Unless it was a trap, he realized. All this was a stylized and ornate trap. Sharaman shouted, but the lead craft was already dropping its load of goblin powder over the side. The first bomb struck the war machine, and the entire device detonated. The lead ornithopter was enveloped in flame, disintegrating in mid-flight. Sharaman flung himself to the ground as bits of flaming metal rained down around him. When he looked up, Urza's was the only craft left in the sky. Its white wings were on fire now, and it trailed a banner of smoke. It made a beeline for the oversized rear wheel of the now ruined war hulk. The ornithopter struck the Wayne's wheel and evaporated in a great explosion as its double cargo of goblin bombs exploded. The Great Wayne rocked, then slowly tumbled over on its side, its burning wreckage slamming into the desert sands. Among the smoking wreckage, framed by the fires of the Great Wayne, a figure moved. Sharaman hobbled toward it, unsure if he should greet or battle the figure. It was Urza. His flying cloak was singed and burning in several spots, and there were numerous cuts along the right side of his face. He clutched something to his chest, something that glowed as brightly as an ember. Urza coughed into the burning sleeve of his other arm and then started to beat the sleeve against his leg, extinguishing the smoldering blaze. "Trap," he said as Sharaman reached him. "Yes, sire," said Sharaman. "Should have." Another long, smoke-filled cough. "Should have seen it coming." He shook his head. "Any others?" Sharaman looked at the smoking plumes around the camp. "I don't think so." "We should go, then," said Urza. "Long walk back to camp." "Longer walk back to Yosha." "Sire." "What?" "I'm afraid my leg's broken," said Sharaman. Despite everything, he felt embarrassed to mention it. Urza's face twitched, as if Sharaman had mentioned some small, niggling problem. Then his eyes cleared, and the chief artificer said, "Of course. So it is. You rest here. I'll get some splints made. We'll check the other craft to see if there are any supplies or perhaps a temple amulet among the wreckage. Then we'll walk back." "As you wish, sire." Urza turned and regarded the smoking hulk of the war machine. He shook his head, and Sharaman heard him say, "Brother, why did you do this?" Why the elaborate and costly ruse? Sharamen wondered that as well. When they finally reached the ocean border weeks later, they would both know the answer. The attack came at dawn and was totally unexpected. Word had come that Urza's flight had failed to report in, and reluctantly, Taunos had dispatched the home flight to the north. Aid in the search. That left only a single large training machine in the capital itself. Later Taunos would wonder if dispatching the last organized flight had been the signal for the attack, if Urza's disappearance in the desert had enheartened the Qadir's troops for the assault, or if it had been Mishra's plan to attack regardless of what happened to Urza. Krug was bounded on three sides by stout walls and on the fourth by the Marden itself, and it was across that great river that the desert-dwelling Phalangi came. Urza and Taunos, and most of the rest of Krug, had felt that any assault of the Marden territories would be sufficient warning for the capital. To ensure their own safety, the Yotians had established a set of beacon towers along the far bank to give warning. It had not been enough. By strength or by trickery, the Phalangi had overpowered the beacon tower guards in the dead of night, and by morning they were ready with their assault. The morning was a foggy and wet one, the mists pooling over the Marden itself. The river fishes, among the first ones up in the city, had the first and only warning. Beneath the lightening sky, as they were loading their nets into the boats and making ready to get underway, one of the crew shouted and pointed toward the center of the river. There were other craft already on the river drifting toward the city docks. There were barges, rowboats, and hastily built rafts and ferries stolen from upriver. They were loaded with men, armed men with flowing robes. Beneath their armor, curved blades, and wide brass hats. The river fishes were alone in their discovery only for a moment, for the next instant the warning beacons across the river came to life, billowing great jets of flame into the sky, heralding the dawn. But the beacons were not set as warnings, but rather as declarations of war. Some of the fishes fled the boats, but others remained long enough to see the great serpentine heads of the dragon engines burst from the grey waters of the Marden and tower o'er Krug's docks, grasping the shore with their front claws and churning the soft mud of the river bank beneath the treads. The dragon engines waded into the city. There was the sound of a great machine inhaling, and the leading beast exhaled a torrent of liquefied flame. Behind it, the first wave of Phalangi landed, bellowing war cries as they clambered onto the docks. The city of Krug was under assault. Taunos had been sleeping at the ornery, as he did often in these later days. When the runner came, the messenger was no more than a young girl and was frightened beyond belief. Taunos sent her to round up what students she could find from the barracks, and to tell them to ready every available Avenger and the remaining Ornithopter, and if he did not return before the palace was assaulted, the students were to use these devices in their own defense. Taunos dressed as he ran toward the royal quarters. The seneschal and the captain of the guard were already there, arguing with the queen. "I am staying," she said. Already she was beginning to show her pregnancy. "Your Majesty, for your own safety," begged the captain. "As a temporary relocation," added the seneschal at the same moment. "I am staying," said Caleb firmly. "This is my home." She looked at Taunos. "I want to stay." "That may not be wise," said Taunos. "Best prepare for flight now and feel foolish about it later." To the captain he asked, "What is the situation?" "There was no warning," said the captain. "Rafts of phalangy. Devils are coming downstream. More are pouring into the river. Woods all the time. The naval station and the fishermen's docks were hit first. And there are dragon engines, 3 at least. Maybe 4. They seem to be leading the assault, spreading destruction ahead of them. We've regrouped all the troops in the capital, but the people are blocking the streets. Open the gates, or ordered Kayla. Let the people escape the city." "But the enemy," objected the captain, "is already within our walls," snapped Kayla. "Do we need to sacrifice the people as well?" The captain nodded. Taunos asked, "How long before they reach here?" The seneschal stuttered and spat. There is no indication that they are. "These are Mishra's engines," snapped Taunos, a new steel in his voice. "Where else would they be heading?" The captain thought for a moment, then said, "An hour. 2 if we're fortunate. Is there anything you have on hand to help?" "I'm working on it now," said Taunos. To Kayla he said, "Pack what you can carry. If it comes to this, we will need to flee." Kayla started to complain, and Taunos added, "Take my advice this time, please. Prepare for the worst, hope for the best. Have the matron help you." He looked around, suddenly noticing that the matron's impressive bulk was missing. "Where is she?" There was a silence for a moment, then the seneschal stammered, "She has a sister in the river wards." Said she was worried about her. Taunos's lips made a thin, grim line. "Pack," he said. "I'll be back." The students were already at the ornery when the chief apprentice returned. 5 Avengers were in working order, though. Each required an operator to stand close and give commands. Taunos assigned 5 of the oldest boys to take them and report to the captain. He scribbled a hasty note to the captain that the boys should be kept together and used to fight the dragon engines. He added that if the Avengers fell, the boys were to flee the city as quickly as they could. There was only a single ornithopter ready, but it was a huge craft capable of carrying a fully armored Avenger easily. Taunos ordered the remaining boys to pack this craft full of Urza's notes and prototypes. One lad hesitated. He was one of the young ones, in his first year of studies. "Sir, aren't we going to fight?" he asked. Taunos nodded. "Yes, but we need to protect our knowledge. Get it to safety first." "But," said the youth, sputtering, "we can use the ornithopter to fight, can't we?" Taunos looked down on the young man. "Fight? How? We could drop bombs on them. But they are in our city, and we would be bombing our people. The Avengers will buy us time, but probably they can't defeat the dragon engines by themselves. Do you understand?" The boy looked at his feet. "I suppose I would rather fight." Taunos looked at him grimly. "And I would rather win the fight," he said. "Do you understand the difference?" Another pause. "Then, I suppose so." "Good," said Taunos. "Because you're going to fly the ornithopter. If you have to fight, you'll. But remember that the important thing is to get the ornithopter, and particularly the books, away to one of the more remote bases farther east. If they have fallen, then head to Corliss, or even Argive. Do you understand?" The boy nodded, and Taunos helped the youths load the ornithopter. In the distance there came the sound of explosions, and once or twice of shouting. Finally the huge ornithopter was loaded, and Taunos gave the lad the Jalam tome. As he took it, the boy said, "My brother, he's another student here." Sanwell. Taunos hesitated. "Do you want me to send him with you?" "He's one of the older students," said the boy. Taunos nodded slowly. He had sent the older students with the Avengers into battle. The boy said, "If you see him, tell him I left. And tell him not to worry. Your name is Rendell, right?" "Rendell," agreed the boy, setting the great book on his lap. "I'll tell him when I see him, Rendell, and the Godspeed." "You," said Taunos. "And God's help us all," he added to himself as the boy engaged the power stone and the great craft came to life. The great ornithopter strained at its pulleys and leaped into the sky in a single bounce. It did not make the low climbing circle common in training flights. Instead it flew arrow straight to the east. Behind it there was the screeching of the dragon engine that witnessed its departure. That made Taunos feel slightly better. If Mishra was going to take Urza's city, he was not going to take Urza's knowledge. He dismissed the rest of the students, telling them to take what they could carry and head east as quickly as possible, regrouping at the caravan town of Hench. And if that had fallen, he said, make for the coast or call us. He looked at the faces and knew that a few would go for weapons and joined the melee, but enough would have the common sense to let the schools survive. Taunos took Ashnod's staff from its holder and left the ornery for the last time, making for the guest wing. The guards were still at the positions outside Ashnod's door. Taunos dismissed them, ordering them to help protect the palace. "Helliver of a party," said Ashno as he entered. "Pity we're missing it." Her words were light, but her face was drawn and concerned. "I need your help," said Taunos. "We need to get out of the city." "We?" asked Ashno. "Does that include me?" "I mean, these are my people coming to call." "These are the Phalagi," shouted Taunos. "Do you think they can tell the difference between you and any other non-Phalagi woman in the middle of the battle?" "If I have my staff, they will," replied Ashno calmly. "Give it to me." "Promise to help," said Taunos. "Promise to help me get the queen to safety. Or, if we're captured, guarantee her safety." "Why should I help your precious queen?" snapped Ashno harshly. "She's pregnant," said Taunos. "I hope you don't think you're appealing to my motherly instincts," began Ashno. "Mishra may be the father," interrupted Taunos. "Do you want to tell him his child died in the taking of the city?" Ashno sat down. "Woo," she said. Outside the window there was an explosion. Too close for Taunos's mind. "Never even heard that rumor. Are you sure?" Taunos looked at his hands. "No." Ashno shook her head and chuckled. "Well, that's good enough for me. I promise to help get your precious queen away from here. Or if you're captured, to guarantee fair treatment. Can I have my staff now?" Taunos hesitated for a moment and then gave her the staff. She ran her fingers over it and said, "I expected you to dismantle it." "I did," said Taunos, heading for the door. "And I rebuilt it. Let's go." The hallways were empty now, and through the windows of the promenade Taunos and Ashno could see the rising plumes of smoke. Through it, far off in the city, Taunos saw a dragon engine. "There was more than one," he said bitterly. "Yep," said Ashno. "I told you, but you weren't paying enough attention." "Maybe I should have given you to the priests," snarled Taunos. "Then who would help you now?" They ran into the Queen and the Seneschal at the entrance to the royal quarters. The Seneschal was carrying a large carpet bag filled with the Queen's personal effects. Ashno looked at the Queen's swelling belly. "You have let yourself go," she said. Taunos asked, "Status?" The Seneschal stammered and said, "Be bad." The Avengers slowed the lead dragon engine B, but it just pulled back and let tribesmen overwhelm the Avengers and their operators. Some people think the Queen has already left the city in an ornithopter. Taunos mentally kicked himself. It had not occurred to him to use the ornithopter to rescue the Queen and not Urza's notes. Or himself, for that matter. "We need to make haste," said the Seneschal. "The engines will be here any moment." The earth shook, and a deep, fiery roar proved the Seneschal wrong. The dragon engines had already arrived at the palace of Krug and were slamming their great shovel-like muzzles as battering rams against the walls. The hallway rocked, and half of it slid away, breaking apart under the assault of the engine. Stonework and furnishings suddenly collapsed as if a great blade had cut through the palace itself. In the wake of the cave-in, more of the hallway slid into a churning dust cloud. Taunos grabbed Kayla and pulled her close to him onto more solid ground. The Seneschal was not so fortunate. The ground beneath him broke like brittle ice in the spring, and with a scream he toppled forward into the abyss. Kayla shouted as the Seneschal vanished in the churning debris, still clutching Kayla's carpet bag. Ashno lashed out an arm and grabbed Taunos's shoulder. "Let's go. Her Majesty can get new luggage later." Taunos's brows furrowed in anger, but there was no time for argument. The entire royal wing was slowly coming apart beneath the treads of the dragon engine. The beast screeched again, and the three, Ashno, Taunos, and Kayla, fled down the hallway, away for the assault. They made it to the main entranceway before they ran into Phalange troops. "An honor guard," noted Taunos briefly, from the look of their hats and carved gold epaulets. The three refugees were descending the main staircase when the desert tribesmen spilled into the hall beneath them. For a moment both parties froze. Then Ashno took a step forward down the stairs and shouted, "These people are under my protection." A large figure separated from the rest of the Phalange. This one was dressed in resplendent armor of tooled leather and was fat to the point of obesity. "You are a woman. You cannot offer such protection." Ashno stiffened, and Taunos realized that the two knew each other. "I am the apprentice of your Raki, O powerful one," she said, venom in her voice. "I can do as I please." "A pity," said the fat Phalange, "since in all the confusion of the battle, my men killed you before we knew who you were. I am afraid Mishra will have to understand later." Ashno looked shocked. "Why are you doing this?" The fat one smiled. "Mishra depends you, as a man leans on a crutch. My father once said that it is a bad thing for a man to have a crutch. I do this to make Mishra stronger. To his men he said, 'Kill 'em all.'" Taunos shouted and pulled his blade, pushing Kayla behind him. Ashno screamed an obscenity and brought up her staff. The golden wired skull hummed and spat sparks. The Phalange soldiers did not make it farther than the bottom 2 steps. They went down, clutching their necks and bellies from the painful force of Ashnod's attack. Even behind her, Taunos could feel the intensity of the assault. Kayla huddled against him. The Queen was muttering to herself, and Taunos realized that The words were prayers to one god after another. The soldiers collapsed in gasping piles, but Ashno did not let up her attack. Instead she turned her staff on the fat one who had threatened her. The staff's tip glowed a brighter shade, and the wires incandesced, glowing from their own heat. The fat one clutched at his throat and spun around in place like a puppet, but Ashno did not relent. Taunos could see blood spurting from the man's ears, nose, and eyes. When Ashno finally lowered her staff, the fat one collapsed in a heap, dead among his unconscious soldiers, a puppet with his strings cut. Ashno slumped as well, and Taunos reached out to steady her. She was bathed in cold sweat, and a thin trickle of blood streamed from her nose. She said, rubbing the blood off on her sleeve, I really have to fix the glitch in this staff's design. Taunos helped both women down the stairs, past the dead and unconscious men. He paused only slightly at the fat one, laying with his ruined face oozing blood. You knew this one. Ashno looked at the face of the dead Kadir of the Phalange. Some desert nobody, she said bitterly. Mishra is better off with him gone. Kayla wanted to head east, joining the refugees fleeing the city, but Ashno took them westward instead, toward the docks. They were stopped by 2 Phalange patrols, but each time these soldiers recognized Ashnet's claim that the 2 Yotians were under her protection. That was fortunate, thought Taunos, for Ashno was nearly dead on her feet from the first battle and could not sustain another. They had passed through the front of the fighting now, and all that was left behind the advancing army was blackened devastation. What houses were not crushed by the engines had been set alight, and flames guttered at every window. There was no one in the streets but the dead. Taunos found one of the Avengers, its legs removed by the Phalange, still flailing around in circles in the middle of one of the plazas. Taking a moment, Taunos deactivated it and removed the power stone. There was no sign of the device's operator. At last they reached the docks. The quays were abandoned, like the rest of the city. Ashno chose one of the smaller of the attacking boats, still moored at a wharf. Here, she said, get in. We should go east, said Kayla weakly. Ashno shook her head. Mishra's troops are going to be chasing refugees east for the next 2 weeks, looking for you, she said to Kayla, and turned to Taunos. And you, and anyone else connected with Urza, head south to the coast, then go east. For there. Taunos helped Kayla over the gunwales of the rowboat. The Queen of Krug fled to the far end of the vessel and pulled her cape tightly around her. Taunos turned to Ashno. You knew this attack was coming? He asked. I mean, now. Ashno shook her head. If I did know, and if I had told you, would you have believed me? I've given you what you want. I'm going now. She clutched her staff as if Taunos might try to take it from her. They might still kill you, the apprentice said. Less of a danger now. Trust me on that one, she said. If I find Mishra, everything will be fine. You take care of her. Majesty. You really think she's carrying Mishra's whelp? I don't know, said Taunos softly. I'm not sure she knows either. Ashno shook her head. Still playing the baby duck even when the mommy ducks are heading for the abattoir. Your loyalty will put you in a spot someday where even I can't help you. Best of luck, duck. She kissed him quickly but long enough for Kayla to observe. Then with a wink and a wave the scarlet-haired woman disappeared. back into the burning city. Taunos watched until Ashna vanished among the smoke and burning ash. Then he took the long pole and pushed the boat away from the docks into the main current of the river. The apprentice and the queen watched the city burn as they floated away from it and watched the smoke that marked its spire. Long after the flanking hills hid the devastation from direct view, the rest of the journey for that day and for the next few days was in silence as they moved sluggishly down the river. The sense of loss and their responsibility for it weighed heavily on the tiny craft. Chapter 16. Aftermaths. It had taken Urza nearly a month to return to the wreckage of Krug, first walking out of the desert with the wounded Lieutenant Sharaman, then regrouping the embattled Yotian forces in the sword marches and organizing an orderly retreat south. The sword marches fell behind them and most of northern Yotia as well. But there was nothing left there to fight for, nothing to sustain an army. The Phalangi harried the flanks but left them alone. Urza's forces got within 2 days' flight of Krug, which was still in enemy territory. The prince consort and de facto ruler in the continued absence of the queen took a trio of ornithopters to the wreckage. Mishra, now known to Yotians as the Butcher of Krug, had abandoned the city, and his dragon engines left little standing. The massive walls themselves had been left untouched, though. Their mighty gates had been worked from their hinges and splintered. Everything within the walls had been burned, and that which resisted burning had been crushed beneath the dragon engine's treads. A grey rain of ashes and dust fell on the city. For 3 days after the razing, there was little looting. Afterward, because there was little to loot, all that was left were the walls and a slope of grey rubble leading down to the Marden River, and beyond the walls a scattering of lean TOS belonging to refugees too stubborn or stupid to move elsewhere. 3 ornithopters alit on the low hillock where the palace would have been. Urza and Sharaman climbed from their machines, but the third pilot remained with his craft, ready to take off it. The first sign of trouble. There was nothing to do except watch and nothing to see except the ash-covered rubble. Urza stood in one spot, then moved a few feet over it, then moved to a third location. Occasionally he picked up a bit of rock or let a handful of soot sift between his fingers. It seemed to Sharaman that the ruler was trying to imagine what building stood there and where he would be within that building. There was a great pile of rubble that had been burned, blasted, and then cleared. At first Sharaman thought it had been a great court, but he soon realized that it was the site of Urza's ornery and that it had been scraped down to bedrock. Urza stood in the dead center of the cleared circle and knelt down, putting his hands over his eyes. There was not even any rubble left for him to touch. People began to drift in from the gates. Sharaman tensed for a moment, but he realized these were little more than Yotian refugees from the camps outside. Leaving Urza to his revelry, Sharaman went to meet them. Sharaman had been in Krug a handful of times, the first when he received his flight training. It had been an amazing city to a boy from the eastern provinces, a boy who had been given a ride in an ornithopter when Urza flew to Korlinda. Now that was a lifetime ago, and mighty Krug was a dead ruin. Sharaman went and talked to the refugees, then returned to where Urza stood, a young boy in tow. "Sire," he said gently, "and I always accused my brother of not finishing anything," said Urza softly. Then his eyes focused and he turned to Sharaman, once more the chief artificer. "What "There are people here," said Sharaman. "They want to know what to do." "Do," said Urza, his voice sounding strangled. "What can they do?" "Tell them to head south, or east, or west, or wherever they think they can find safety. Tell them that there is nothing for them here. Perhaps it would be better if they heard it from you," said Sharaman. Urza looked to Sharaman. "And say what?" "That I'm sorry I failed them. That I'm sorry that I wasn't here for them. That I'm sorry that my brother fooled me. That I'm sorry that my wife and my apprentice and my work are all gone." Urza's voice rose as he spoke, and Sharaman wondered if the chief artificer would weep. Instead, the older man shook his head and said, "No, I have failed them. They should go find someone who has not failed and follow him." For the first time he noticed the youth. "And this is, he says he's one of your students," said Sharaman. Urza peered at the youth. "Perhaps your name is Rendell." "Sanwell, sire," said the youth. "Rendell is my younger brother. He's the one Master Taunos chose to fly the Ornithopter away." Urza looked to Sharaman, and there was a new light in his eyes. Ornithopter. Then someone escaped this within. Ornithopter. Slowly, Sanwell told the story which he had heard from another student after the battle. His younger brother had taken most of the important papers and designs and flew them east. No one else went with him. Yes, with orders to go to Argivith. Need be to escape the Phalange. No, he didn't know what had happened to Master Taunos and the Queen. Sanwell's Avenger had been overwhelmed by a number of desert fighters. It had taken out a number of them, but there were too many of them. When he was done, Urza rose, and there was a new fire in his eyes. "So, my brother," he said, "you didn't finish this either." Sharaman. "Yes, sire. I want you to take our remaining forces south. Regroup what you can and fortify the ports." "Yes, sire." "And what of you?" "I am going to find the knowledge that Taunos saved for me." Rendell. "Sanwell, sire." "Are there any other from the school here?" Sanwell looked around at the desolation. "No, sire." "Then you'll come with me," said Urza sharply. "We have to find out where your brother went with my work and begin again." "And this time," said the chief artificer among the wreckage of Krug, "this time, I will not stay my hand or feel mercy for you, brother. This time there will be a reckoning. I swear it." And as if in response to his words, a cold wind blew up from the river, scattering ashes around his feet. The caverns of Koilos had visitors. Non-Argivian visitors. They were from a monastery along the northern shores of the continent, a theocracy that celebrated the power and the majesty of the Thran, and more importantly, their devices. They claimed large territory, but they had been relatively reclusive. They found that other cultures did not share their respect for the machine's workings, that others sought to batter them, like the Phalange, or to make pale shadows of the Thran creations, like the Argivians. So they remained a quiet people, venturing out only rarely beyond the borders, until the dreams came. They began over a year ago. First one brother, then another, then a third, all consumed by the same vision, a world of machines far beyond the abilities of the Thran, living engines of steel and cable, of indestructible hearts pumping vital oils through the body, steel leaves and saw toothed grasses, a world that rained oil and bloomed with mechanism. In short, paradise. And the dreams enraptured the dreamers with its siren call. urging them to leave their lands, to come to the center of the dream, and to work miracles there at the center. Under the urgings of the dream, the Brotherhood of GIX responded. 24 of the most trusted brothers, those who had served the cause of the machine most devotedly, left their homes and headed south. They avoided the Malpari tribesmen who regularly raided their lands, but a few fell to the dangers of the desert itself. Exposure, heat, and bandits. Only a dozen arrived at Koilosa a year later, and they were an emaciated lot dressed in windblown rags and possessing a wide-eyed, fanatical expression. As they traveled, the dreams grew stronger in them. The dreams showed him the canyon that would lead him to the goal, and the cavern that they would find there. They pulled out ancient stones that glowed of their own light and journeyed within the cave, stepping around the wreckage of ancient machines that had been tested and found insufficient in the eyes of their great machine god. At last they stood before the great machine. They took the gathered light stones and placed them within the machine as they had been instructed by the dreams, and passed their hands over the mysterious book of glyphs. The fact that they could not read the glyphs bothered them not. The only thing that mattered was the dream, and the dream told them what to do. The monks of the Brotherhood of GIX were not surprised when the lights of the cavern flickered to life around them, nor when the machines themselves began to sing, communing with each other and singing praises to the god. Delight flickered on the faces of the Gixians, knowing that their dreams were about to become reality. A great disk formed in the middle of the air, like an oil puddle that had been turned on its side. It shimmered with a rainbow of colors not found on this earth, for these were rather the colors of dreams. The pool widened to the height and width of a tall man, and something stepped through it. It was tall and humanoid. It seemed to be wearing an armor of black metallic snakes, but to the monks' delight they recognized that it was the skin of the being, a skin of metal and coils. Its face was skeleton white, and it sprouted more tendrils from its head, great blood-colored serpents. As one, the monks fell to their knees in worship. The godly being, servant of the machine god, stood before its glowing portal. It sniffed the air, as if experiencing it for the first time. It stretched its sinewy cable muscles and turned its head from side to side, testing the extent of its body. One of the monks, the leader among the survivors, slowly rose and spoke. "Welcome, most holy creation. What may we call you, that we may better serve you?" The machine being looked at each of them, and there was a soft mental caress as its mind touched theirs. It had been the one to send the dreams, they realized. It had been the one to call them to this place. The machine being's lips whirred as they formed themselves into a smile. "GIX, it said at last, in a voice only Mishra and Ashno had heard before. "You may call me GIX." Part 3. Converging Trajectories. Chapter 17. Mishra's Workshop. The imperial court had changed while Ashno had been away, which was no surprise to the apprentice. In the year since the fall of Krug, she had left and returned a half-dozen times, and upon each return she discovered some new wing or pit or chamber had been added to the court of the new Kadir of the Phalange. Mishra had selected a site on the northwest tip of the Kaicha ridges, with a dominating view of the arid lands to the west. Through a trick of the weather patterns, this area was well watered and was swathed in trees so large that they might have been planted by the Thran themselves. They were some type of oak, with thick, heavy trunks and long, horizontal branches. Already, some of the quarters and laboratories were being nestled among those branches. When Mishra became Qadir, Ashna reflected he wished to set down roots. Perhaps, among the great trees. This was what she meant, literally. The first time she had seen a sight, she had trouble believing that such huge growths had blossomed in a land that was elsewhere bone dry and arid. Surrounding the grove of great trees, most of the smaller timbers, still great, towering oaks and younger maples, downslope, had been cleared. Part of the clearing was for cultivation, but more of it was for smaller foundries and forges. Already the residue of those forges built slag, the unusable remains of their industry, down the slopes and into the streams at the foot of the hills. The latest addition was a great barn that dominated an area at one end of the encampment. It was constructed of half hoops of metal with fabric stretched between them. Already slave laborers were laying stonework for permanent walls along the base. Ashno let a slave stable hand take her horse and entered the workshop proper. One of the great trees had died eons ago, leaving a massive stump over 60 feet high and twice that in diameter. Mishra had the stump hollowed out and converted into his own private workshop to rival the crushed ornery in now dead Krug. Now that workshop towered above her, the windows carved through it sat a bark lit by fires within. The windows were oddly shaped, formed more by the twists of the once living bark than by Mishra's own needs. To Ashno, the windows looked like malignant, winking eyes. The rooms within were similar odd, strange shapes that resembled teardrops or spirals or multi-planed solids. Rooms rose slightly from one end to the other or were constructed of numerous terraces, each with different machinery. Ashno had no doubt that there were additional rooms within the structure that had not been there when she had last been present. Such was the sprawling nature of the new Qadir's domains. One thing that had not changed was the treasure pile in the hallways, the remains of the initial looting of Krug. There was gold platerware and cracked crystal gems spilling out of wooden boxes split by rough handling, and rare vases of blue and white glazing with longitudinal cracks running from rim to base. All of it was gathered to celebrate the power of the Rakia, the Suwardi, their new Qadir by acclamation of the Phalaji Empire. The mighty Mishra. One wall had been cleared to allow diplomats, supplicants, courtiers, and other parasites to wait at Mishra's whim. Ashno did not have to wait, of course, and breezed past these poor wretches. She felt the pressure of their eyes as she passed and smiled. That was one of the good things about returning to Mishra's workshop. The workshop proper was 2 parts library, 2 parts workshop, and 2 parts throne room. A great dark oak throne had been pushed against one wall, piled high with pillows and resting on a carpet of pure, regal purple, pulled from the wreckage of the Palace of Krug. The throne was flanked on both sides by piles of books. There were books looted from Yosha and shipped from Zegon and Tomikul. Huge folios and small personal diaries, scrolls and tablets and all manner of journals, bound in leather of beasts both common and forgotten. Ashno noted, not for the first time, that many of the volumes had gathered a thin pattern of dust and had not been disturbed since their initial placement. Ashno thought of the Urza's ornery. Even cleaned and organized for the visit, it had a cluttered look. But it was a busy clutter, and organized chaos, one that was continually in motion, continually evolving. The books in Mishra's workshop might as well be blank for the amount of use they saw. Mishra was not on his throne, while the others cooled their heels outside. He was at a great slate board, another prize of the war, that had been hung along one curved wall. Mishra had been working in multicolored chalk, and out of the rainbow smears of his writings and frequent erasures, there arose the portrait of a dragon engine's head, bedecked with arcane letters and illegible scribbles. Haja, ever faithful Haja, stood by the throne and announced Ashnod's presence, which was fortunate, for Ashnod felt that Mishra would not bother to look up otherwise. Mishra regarded Ashnod, and the apprentice could sense a tenseness, a coiled spring nervousness, in the master. He tapped the chalk against the slate a few more times, then tossed the chalk into its box, and padded toward his throne. Report, he grunted as he retook his place among the pillows. With each her visits, Mishra had become more brusque, more abrupt with her. Elevated to the supreme position, and with the added responsibilities of running the far-flung empire, he had no longer any time to be polite, even if he had the inclination. Plunder from the Yotian provinces, said Ashnod, proffering an inventory list that Haja took. She folded her hands before her for a dry recitation. 4,000 pounds of gold, 6,000 of silver, including 2,000 buyur, 17 vases in good condition filled with gemstones worth. Mishra waved away Ashnod's words, and said, books. Ashnod sighed. Master Mishra had become more impatient of late. 5 new volumes on alchemy not in your collection. 3 volumes on optics. 2 on hydraulics that may be of vital interest, and 1 volume on metallurgy in the Yotian style, which may prove invaluable. 1 on clocks, which sings the praises of its author. Records of gem-cutting, tinsmithing, and architecture. The standard collection of journals and diaries that will have to be read to determine if they contain anything useful. A large number of maps, most of Corlesian trading routes. Mishra nodded, folded hands before him, and patted his fingers together. Usable resources. 3 new mines have been seized, bringing the total to 17, said Ashnod. There were 18, but Yotian rebels pulled the main support frames out from one, choosing to seal themselves inside rather than surrender. 4 foundries have been dismantled and are being relocated here, and they should be operational within 2 months. Smaller forges are being set up in the Suwardi marches. Lumbering continues in northern Yotia, but under armed protection. Mishra nodded again, and said, news. More of the same, said Ashnod. The surviving Yotian towns along the coast are willing to pay tribute and swear fealty, at least on the surface. However, raids and rebellions are common from the Suwardi marches south. As a result, any timetable involving Yotian resources is questionable at best. There is no shortage of slaves from among the captured revolutionaries and fallen towns. Ashnod was gilding the truth at best. For the first time the Phalangi were controlling a population not of Phalangi blood, and with it the traditional ties to the Qadir. A more heavily armed presence was needed in Yotia to control the people and guard the plunder. That tied down manpower, and the Phalangi hated to be tied down. Mishra did not pursue the nature of the unrest in his new conquests. Instead, he simply said, and my brother still beyond the K8 ridges, said Ashno. The report always devolved down to this simple question, and Ashnod's simple response. The plunder, the resources, the knowledge were all secondary to the activities of Mishra's brother. As far as you know, said Mishra. Ashno sighed, trying to hide her impatience. Since taking the mantle of command, Mishra had changed, and not for the better. As far as we currently know, ornithopters have been sighted along all the major passes eastward. But there has been no organized Yotian resistance. Urza is said to have established an encampment in Argive, near the Corlys border, but Corlys swears neutrality in the matter in exchange for access to Phalange markets. Haja made a huffing noise. Most of the Phalange considered the collisions as bad as the Yotians, spreading honeyed lies of friendship while driving the hardest of bargains. Were the Corlys merchants truly interested in pleasing the Phalange, they would have captured Urza and turned him over when Mishra's brother had crossed into the territory. What is he waiting for? Said Mishra, patting his fingers together. It's been a year. The loss of Krug and most of the northern Yosha has struck him hard, said Ashno. He may simply be in hiding. He never hides, said Mishra hotly. He plots. He plans. He is still in communication with the Yotian towns, I am sure of it. And the rebels act on his command. He is waiting for the right moment. For the moment of weakness. Of inattentiveness. And then Mishra raised both hands to indicate the magnitude of his brother's imagined revenge. Ashno bit her lip, then said, if that is the case, perhaps we should lay siege to the remaining Yotian towns and plunder them as well, denying him any further resources. Our dragon engines have been quiet for surprisingly long. Mishra made a grunting noise and slid off his throne. He motioned for Ashno to follow as he headed for a side door to his throne room. Ashno followed, and the rear of the procession was brought up by Haja. The side door led to a spiral stairway that corkscrewed through the once living wood of the workshop. That in turn led to a postern gate alongside the massive stump. Mishra walked through the new barn, a curious Ashno and an impassive Haja in tow. A few of the slaves building the walls paused to watch them pass, and earned a beating from the slave masters for their effrontery. The interior of the new building was a single room dominated by two great machines. Small figures, scholars sent by Zegon and Tomikul, and students from among the brightest of the Phalange, climbed over the machines like ants over a carcass. The first of the machines looked very much like a carcass. It was one of the dragon engines, laying on its side. Its lower treads had been removed, and the plates along its belly had been pried loose to reveal the network of cables beneath. These had been uncoiled, like entrails, to reveal pumps and servos within the heart of the beast. Several small gems glittered weakly within the great wounds of the creation, but for the most part it was an inert thing, a dead creature. Alongside it was a second dragon engine, which resembled the first as a child's drawing of a horse resembles the real creature. It was all hammered angles and sharp edges, and lacked the graceful fluid styling of the partially dismantled creature. Beside it, its face was similar but frozen in a parody of the original dragon engine. Its muscles were not fluid cables but roughly hewn slabs of metal held together by rivets and welds. The second dragon engine was under construction, and as Ashno watched, the scholars and students managed to get it to raise a foreleg. It was functional, but it looked less a living thing than the damaged beast next to it. It was injured in Krug, said Mishra regarding the fallen dragon engine, his face almost pained by the sight, against one of my brother's accursed Avengers. It survived the battle, but one by one its systems began to fail. It faltered, it was paralyzed along one side, and then it went blind. There was nothing for it but to slowly monitor its decay. None beyond this encampment know this. Ashno shrugged. You have the other dragon engines, and the same may happen to them, said Mishra hotly. I don't know what tricks my brother has planned, and with each day, he may have more of them. Can you imagine what would happen if one of these engines collapsed on the battlefield? What if the enemy saw that my creations were defeatable? Ashno thought about it, then nodded slowly. And my brother is capable of defeating them. This I know, said Mishra. If only I had remained alongside it, but no. Instead I chose to take an engine in a fruitless pursuit of one of Urza's ornithopters, thinking it held possible hostages. A small error on my part, but a fatal one for this engine. If I had remained in Krug, this one would still be functional. If you had remained in Krug, thought Ashno, you would likely not be Kadir now. But Mishra knew nothing of that, nor of her involvement with Taunos and the Queen. She only nodded. Mishra waved at the other construct. And this is but a shadow. A puppet crafted to resemble the original. It has most of the power, and none of the grace of the original. None of the sentience. None of the life. There are secrets locked within the dying body, terrible secrets that are beyond our power to duplicate. Perhaps Urza. Mishra's voice trailed off, then returned with iron behind the tone. Urza kid, which is why we must ready these new engines, new devices, to keep him at bay. Ashno said, Master Mishra, I think I can help. Mishra turned to her. You can rebuild the dying engine. Ashno looked at the carcass of the original dragon engine. It looked like Arian, picked apart by beetles. She shook her head. Your own plans proceed apace. Allow me to return to my own studies, and I can give you weapons to defeat your brother. I need you to oversee the plundering of Yosha, said Mishra. Only you know what is valuable and what is dross. Ashno shook her head. Much of what is valuable from Yosha has already been taken, or can be demanded as tribute, or has been pirated away to Corlus. You don't need me to scavenge, my lord. You need me to think, to help you build. Mishra thought a moment, and Ashno continued, I have had time to think of matters both in my forced rest as a guest of Krug and later, seeking books and information for you. I believe that I can wrap a machine around a spark of life. I believe I can merge the living and unliving together. I can give you the army to defeat Urza. Mishra rocked slightly back and forth, then shook his head. I need you to be my eyes, my ears beyond these walls. There is much I need to have done, and so few, like you and Haja here, who I trust to do it. Ashno tilted her head to one side and said, a pity. Urza would trust Taunos with such a matter. Indeed, it was Taunos the student who distracted you with that fleeing ornithopter, for Urza the master had trained him well. Are you saying that Urza is a better master than you are? A red storm of rage formed on Mishra's face, and for a moment, Ashno wondered if she had pressed too far. But Mishra took a deep breath, and the anger subsided slightly. Sharply, he said, What do you need to produce such an army? Ashno kept her gaze level, as if she had anticipated this request. My own lab, away from prying eyes. She nodded in mock reverence to Haja. Most of the books on biology and anatomy. For the plundered libraries. A portion of the resources sent as tribute. Surgical tools from Zegon. And slaves. Both skilled. One's smiths and glass blowers, and ones that no one will care if they are lost. Mishra was silent for a moment. Will criminals do? He said. Ashno nodded sternly. Criminals, traitors, revolutionaries, deserters, those whose disappearance will not be mourned. What I am thinking would be distasteful to some. She nodded at Haja. Again, but necessarily for us to build an army to defeat your brother. That is one reason I would want to keep the encampment a secret. Mishra paused for a moment, then said, Drit. I cannot promise results today, said Ashno quickly, or tomorrow or the next. But with my research and your rebuilt dragon engines, we can hunt down your brother and destroy him wherever he hides. My brother does not. Mishra stopped himself, then nodded. Take what you need. Send me reports. I want to know what you're doing. And make it quick. My brother will not lay waiting for his chance forever. Ashno added, you should know what I propose to do. It is not a gentle process. Mishra said, these are not gentle times. And we are not a gentle people. Do what you must, but give me the weapons that I need. Do what you must. Ashno bowed low, and Mishra spun on his heels, retreating back up the hillside to his warped workshop. Haja, his silent ghost, followed in his wake. After they returned to closed doors, Ashno thought the Falaji assistant would counsel his Qadir against trusting the scarlet-haired woman, or he would commend the Qadir on his wisdom and be relieved that the woman would no longer be a regular participant in Mishra's court. It mattered not to Ashno. She waited until both figures were out of sight, then she allowed a slow smile to spread across her face. She had gotten what she wanted, her own shop and the freedom to pursue her own studies. And she had learned something else. Whatever else Mishra was, he was afraid. Afraid of his brother. Afraid of being punished for stealing his brother's woman, for destroying his brother's house, for breaking his brother's toys. It was a useful tool to use in dealing with the new Qadir, but one she had to be careful not to blunt with overuse. Speak the magic word and the gates to the treasure swing open, she said to herself, thinking of an old Falaji legend. And the secret word is Urza. She watched the ants scuttle over the two dragon engine carcasses, stripping one to provide life for the other. Then she returned to her own quarters to finalize her plans for the future. Chapter 18. Urza's Tower. It was 3 years after the fall of Krug that Taunos finally rejoined Urza in the most southwesterly of the Argivian provinces. They were hard years, and the toll showed on the apprentice's face, years of running and hiding, of flight and patience, of work and abandoned work. Kayla was with him, and Harben, her son, born in the midst of a monsoon outside Joralan, and now 2.5. They were also accompanied by 2 animated statues Taunos had created during that horrible second winter when Falaji slave-taking patrols had forced him to flee into the Kha ridges. They had finally made their way into Korlis itself, but even then they did not believe they were safe. The coalitions were still trading with the Falaji, and though they were negotiating with the Argivians on a pact of mutual protection from the desert raiders. Kayla was unsure the fugitives would not be turned over to Mishra's representatives as a sign of the merchant's good will. They traveled in secret, and mostly at night. They did not give their real names, though there were enough who recognized Kayla's profile, particularly in the ocean coastal towns, to provide needed aid. It was that very recognition and the threat of exposure it brought that convinced the former queen to head north and east toward Argive and Sanctuary. When word finally reached him that, yes, Urza was in Argive near the Corlisian border, the three, accompanied by the two artificial protectors, made their way to Urza's tower. This was more easily proposed than accomplished. Urza had selected a site far from towns or villages, hard on the flanks of the Kh ridges themselves. The veil of his tower was cloaked in a continual fog, fed by mountain streams cascading to the valley floor around it. To a casual observer, it was a shadowed mountain glen, similar to hundreds of others along the western borders of Corlus and Argive. But this veil curved and extended slightly to the north, and in that northern pocket, hidden by the mists, Urza built his sanctuary. Out of those mists came 5 murky figures, a man on horseback, a woman and a boy on a sturdy pony, and 2 silent statues tirelessly keeping pace. The tower itself was made of white stone and topped by a golden cupola. It looked slender and lonely, flanked by the valley walls themselves. Kayla noted that there was no sign of activity about the place. She commented that it looked as if it had been abandoned. Taunos agreed. In the old days, in Yosha, there would have been ornithopt patrols continually in the air over such an important site. Indeed, were it not for a loyal Yoshan expatriate found in a nearby town 2 days previous, they would have missed the tower entirely. The child, Harbin, squealed and twisted in his place in front of his mother. The misty air was a delight for the child, and he kept trying to reach out and grab a handful of it. Taunos tried explaining that air could not be caught, at least not with one's hands. The boy listened, stern-faced, nodded in agreement, and attempted to grapple with the air the moment Taunos's back was turned. Taunos pulled up his mount 100 paces from the tower. The place was silent as a tombstone. Where were the protections? Had Urza truly abandoned this tower, or had they already been spotted? But if the latter, why was there no welcome? There was a movement to Taunos's right, and he suddenly wheeled the horse in place. Out of the mountain shadows came the reflection of light on metal and a curious, low, chirping sound. A figure stepped into view, followed by a second, and a third. They were a cross between men and metallic insects, their long, ant-like heads perched on spindly necks. They looked as if they were wearing metallic armor pitted by flecks of rust. Then Taunos realized this armor was the body. Beneath the plates, the apprentice could see the mechanisms and levers clatter, forcing the creatures to move forward. Their knees bent backward, like the Avengers, though these constructs were barely as tall as a man's shoulder. They were armed with heavy cleavers mounted on poles, which they brandished at the travelers. The machines were silent. The chirping was nothing more than the wear of metal on metal, of pulleys hissing from cables running through their loops, and of brass strip switches setting and resetting. Taunos heard a strangled cry and looked toward Kayla. There were another 3 on her side of the road, similarly armed and armored. The 2 groups were converging on the travelers. Taunos barked a command at the statues, one of the five they understood, and spurred his mount forward, shouting for Kayla to follow. The horse, a weathered old beast, whinnied a complaint, and moved forward slowly. Equally slowly the two clay statues turned toward their assailants. Each had been taught to recognize weapons and to attack those bearing them. The number of targets confused the statues for a moment. Then each statue chose a wing of the assailants. What followed was a silent battle, one without shouts or cries. The clay statues were armed only with their fists, but they were huge, ham-handed fists, with a great deal of power behind them. The metal automatons were quick, and with their weapons had a reach the statues lacked. A deadly ballet ensued, punctuated by the ring of hard blows landed on armor and the soft chopping noise of blades digging into earth and flesh. The two lead automatons of each wing got too close to the statues and were rewarded with hammer blows to the face. One dodged, but the other caught the blow head-on. Its spindly neck snapped, and the head fell across the creature's back, still held by a tangle of loose wires. The rest of the body did not recognize the loss, but still flailed at the clay opponent with its chopping blade. The blades dug deep, but the clay closed up as soon as the blades cut through it, like soft dough incised by a bread knife. One of the chopping blades got hopelessly mired in the clay creature, and the statue reached out and grasped the automaton's head. It squeezed, and bits of automaton became permanently lodged in the statue's huge hand as it shattered the creature's skull. Two of the automatons fell back, then counterattacked as one. The clay statue raised an arm to ward off the blow, and both attempted to chop at the same arm. The first blade cut deep, and the second deeper still. There was the dull ring of metal on metal and a snapping noise as the second automaton cut through a metal bone at the heart of the clay statue's arm. The statue raised that arm, but most of the clay was sloughing off of it now, revealing a thin metal framework beneath. While the automatons and statues battled, Taunos and Kayla rode for the tower. If Urza was there, then these would be his creations, and he could call them off. If he was absent, the tower might provide some sanctuary until the clay statues had defeated the foes. Taunos shouted at the tower and saw movement along the upper battlement. A tall, familiar figure raised a whistle to his lips. There was the short piping of 3 notes, and Taunos turned in his saddle to see the automatons had ceased their attacks. Unfortunately, the clay statues still saw them as threats, and one snapped off another neck before Taunos shouted the word for them to stand down. The clay statues halted as well, one in mid-punch. Taunos looked up, but the figure was gone from the battlements. The front door opened and a second figure emerged. This was not Urza, but he had the leanness of the chief artificer, and Taunos wondered if he had been mistaken about the figure seen above. This man was dressed in the uniform of a Yoshan officer, a flyer, by the looks of the shadows where patches and insignia once hung. He was a lieutenant, or had been, back when the Yoshans had an armed force. The figure dropped to one knee before the mounted figures. "Your Majesty," he said to the Queen. "Good Sir Taunos. The artificer bids you welcome to his tower. If he had known you were coming, he would have deactivated the guards. I am Sharaman. Please enter and make yourself welcome." He went to Kayla's horse to help her dismount and instead received a handful of young Harben. The former lieutenant looked as if he had been handed a bag of live snakes and quickly but gently put the sandy-haired child down while Caleb dismounted. The lad ignored his brusque treatment but instead craned his head up toward the battlements. Taunos looked up and saw the flicker of the familiar figure of the chief artificer as Urza moved back into the shadows of the balcony doorway. Then the slender figure was gone entirely. Taunos dismounted as Sharaman said, "If you will follow me, I am to make you welcome and to escort you to the artificer." Kayla said, "That will be fine." Sharaman paused and then said, "Your Majesty, I apologize. I was instructed to make both of you welcome but to bring good Sir Taunos to Master Urza. I hope this is not a problem." Kayla and Taunos looked at each other. Taunos had been sure Urza would wish to see his wife first after all these years. Now, there was a tightness to the Queen's lips, and she nodded her agreement. Sharaman put a Queen and Harbin in an austere waiting room on the lower floor, informing him he would return with drinks and, if the mother permitted, sugar wafers. This endeared him immediately to Harbin, who squealed as Kayla gave her assent. The former lieutenant took Taunos up several sets of stairs. "How is he?" asked Taunos at one landing. "He is," said Sharaman briefly. "He's been through a lot. As have we all," thought Taunos, but he said nothing as Sharaman pushed open the final door and stood aside for Taunos to enter. The apprentice stepped into Urza's study, and Sharaman closed the door softly behind him. The room was tasteful and tidy, verging on severe. A thin rug partially covered the wooden floor, and several tilted drawing boards stood near the window's wall, covered with plants in various stages of development. A ball and socket joint, carved of yarrow wood, lay on a small work table next to an open book. Urza himself was at the balcony, his back to Taunos, looking out over the foggy vale and the remains of the earlier battle. His hands were clasped behind him. Taunos waited. At last Urza let out a great sigh and turned toward Taunos. "I had expected a message first," the older man said. Taunos saw the lines on Urza's face, a small collection at the corner of each eye. His eyes seemed deeper as well, more sunk in their sockets, and his hair was turning fully to the shade of spun white gold. He wore his work smock, but it was clean and well pressed. Taunos said, "Messages can be intercepted, sir. And we were not sure of your location until we passed the Argivian border." Urza nodded offhandedly and took another deep breath. Then he forced a smile. "It is good to see that you are alive. I worried when there was no news." "We spent longer than we should have in Yosha," said Taunos. "Yes," said Urza, pressing his palms together and twisting them slowly. "I suppose you had to look on my desk, would you? On the book holder there." Taunos walked over to the desk. "The Jalum tome," he said at last. "The Jalum tome," repeated Urza. "You succeeded, Taunos. All the knowledge you loaded into that ornithopter, young Rendell, made it to Argive, and everything was waiting for me when I finally got to Pendragon. Most of my work, and our papers. There was some lost, but nothing that could not be recouped." One student packed a list of laundry to be picked up, thinking it was an important paper, but under the circumstances it was a brilliant move. Urza looked at Taunos. "Thank you. It was my responsibility," said Taunos, bowing slightly. "And more than adequately discharged," said Urza. "Those statues you brought with you, Very impressive. Clay over a framework of wicker and metal, replied Taunos. That is more than just clay, said Urza. It seemed to shrug off the blows of my own soldiers. Yes, sir, said Taunos, wondering why they were speaking of such matters while Kayla was still waiting. It was from a deposit we found when Her Majesty and I were hiding in the mountains. It had the property of flowing and rejoining when cut. At first I thought it might contain something similar to the Thran stones, but now I am not sure. If I could locate the primal nature of this earth, we could make wonderful creations. Yes, said Urza, and suddenly pointed toward a corner of his workshop. That chest. Look inside. Taunos looked quizzically at the older artificer. But it is? He asked. When Taunos opened the coffer, he was nearly blinded by the light of the stones within. Power stones, he said. Said Urza, pride in his voice. I've never seen this many in one place, remarked the apprentice. Repeated Urza. While we were doing the best we could with what we had in Krug, the Argivian nobles have been collecting them for over 40 years. There's much more than that, more than enough to power any number of devices. That's what the Yoshan soldiers operate off of. Yoshan, said Taunos, a small stab of pain in his voice. Urza held up his hands. A small conceit. My gods. They're smaller than the Avengers and easier to produce. I call them Yoshan soldiers because they will, I hope, prevent Yoshi's fate from visiting Argive and Corlus. An old friend once told me there was power in names. And perhaps, Urza let his voice trail off. Perhaps that will take back Yosha for the Queen, said Taunos. For the Yoshan people, said Urza quickly. For the people who trusted me and whom I delivered into my brother's hands. Your brother has his hands full of them at the moment, said Taunos. Urza did not reply. I understand he leads the Phalange now. Urza nodded. The universe changes. Yosha falls. My brother leads the Phalange. In Argive the crown has lost almost all of its power, for it let Yosha worry about the desert tribes, and now Yosha is gone. The nobles hold most of the power in Penregan, and they are very, very concerned about the Phalange crossing the ridges and attacking. Are you? Asked Taunos. Worried, that is. Urza opened his arms to include the room. This is the result of that worry, Taunos. He said. I can duplicate this power in 5 days, given sufficient materials. I am working on a way to have the Yoshan soldiers themselves build it. Imagine a line of these forts manned by unsleeping soldiers, protecting Argive and Corlus from the Phalange, protecting them from my brother. Taunos nodded. I was surprised not to see any ornithopters. Urza shook his head. The needed to the north, patrolling the passes. Besides sending an ornithopter aloft is sending a flare for the enemy, showing him where you are. That's another lesson learned at great price. Urza stood there for a moment, grinding his palms. Did I tell you we have another school in Penregan this time? Rendell is there, and his brother Samwell. He survived, along with a handful of others. The school is being overseen by an old friend, Ricklau. Did I ever mention Ricklau before? Urza, said Taunos softly. I don't think I did, continued Urza. Anyway, there is a whole raft of young nobles, well, not young anymore, but individuals who once worked with Takesha and who know about artifacts, who value them and are willing to help me in my Research. Urza, said Taunos again. More than just power stones. I mean manpower, training, and resources. Argive is a rich country. Urza, said Taunos a third time, sharply. What is it? Asked Urza testily. Kayla is here, said Taunos. I know, the artificer said, and there was a long pause. Then he said, I know, again, and there was a longer pause. You should go down to meet her, said Taunos. And your son, is he really? Started Urza hotly, but letting the question die. He has your hair, said Taunos. He has my father's hair, said Urza, and turned to look out the window again. I wish you hadn't brought him, he said after a time. By all the gods of Yosha, shouted Taunos, and Urza jumped at the sound of the younger man's voice. We have been running and hiding for 3 years now. I delivered your son, yes, your son, in the middle of a thunderstorm. I bring them all the way here, and you don't want to see them. Do you still hate her so much? Urza turned pale, and Taunos was afraid the older man was going to flinch, to flee, to pull back further within himself. No, he said at last, it's not that. Not entirely. It's just that I failed. I failed to see what was coming. I failed to anticipate my brother's plans. I failed her, and I failed her nation. And I failed, said Taunos grimly. And she failed. We've had to live with that failure every step of the way from Krug. Is that what it is, Urza? Are you ashamed that you're just as fallible as the rest of us? A long silence between them for a moment. Then Urza sighed and said, I'm a stormcrow, Taunos. A bird of ill omen. Disaster follows in my wake, and I don't want to hurt her anymore. I don't want to hurt anyone anymore. Only a fool would be at my side. Then call me a fool, for one, said Taunos. I would like to go back to being your apprentice. Kayla would like to go back to being your wife. Urza turned away again, and Taunos saw him raise his hand to his face, perhaps to wipe away a tear. Yet when Urza turned back, his face was patient and calm, and his eyes were clear. The artificer smiled. I have no need of an apprentice. And your skills with those statues prove that you're a master artificer in your own right. Well, if you don't need an apprentice, you need someone who will get behind you and give a good thwack from time to time, said Taunos. That's a job I can do as well. And do well, said Urza. I need a friend, and you've been one to me, and to the Queen. You have not failed either of us. You're wrong, said Taunos, but we can talk about that some other time. Indeed, we can, said Urza, then nodded his head. Let's go down and see my wife and my son. Slowly they descended the stairs from the tower. Taunos wondered if sound carried as well in the tower as it did in the old palace of Krug. Urza stopped once to point out some feature of the tower to Taunos, then shook his head and pressed on. He realized, Taunos thought, that he was delaying the inevitable. They reached the waiting room. Taunos waited at the door. Sharaman set down the tray of sugar wafers and retreated to the hallway as well. Neither man left, but neither remained in the room. Kayla rose, and Urza walked over to her. They embraced, but it was a polite embrace, each resting their hands on the other's elbows. Still, they did not part, and Taunos could see tears welling in Kayla's eyes. "It is good," rasped Urza, his throat tight. He cleared his throat and said, "It is good to see you again." Kayla's mouth moved, but Taunos did not hear the words. "Hey," said Harbin at the feet. He pulled on Urza's smock, and the artificer looked down at the lad. Harbin looked at Urza, and with all the power that a 2.5-year-old can muster, said, "Uncut, Taunos says you're my daddy. Are you?" Urza looked at Kayla, then down at the small child. He knelt and took the lad's small hand in his own. "I suppose I am," he said. "And I'm very pleased to meet you. After all these years."